Well, from the court systems, we move to taxes. Pawning Our Future, Kansas Failed Tax Experiment, from Annie McKay, who's Executive Director of the Kansas Center for Economic Growth. She joined the center as the Executive Director upon its launch in January 2013. The center is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that conducts research and analysis to promote and advance balanced, responsible budget and tax policies that help ensure that all Kansans will prosper. Before coming to the center, Annie worked as a research analyst at the University of Kansas, coordinating and assisting with the evaluation of early childhood and federally funded programs targeting low-income students. A Kansas native from Hutchinson, she earned her bachelor's degree from KU and has a master's degree from the University of Chicago.
Thank you. I first want to say thanks to Women for Kansas for putting this together. As a native Kansan, to be included on a lineup that has former governors Carlin and Hayden was a pretty special moment for me. I sat in the chair over there just basking in what was a very funny opening, and I'm glad I didn't have to go immediately after them. But I also want to tell a quick story. If you aren't familiar with the Kansas Center for Economic Growth, we launched 3.5 years ago out of work that was previously done by Kansas Action for Children. And when we launched the center, I was the only person staffing the center. And since then, we've grown to a feisty team of 4 that includes former budget director and longtime state representative Dwayne Gosen, who's actually just left the country. Yeah. Yeah, so Dwayne is not with us here today. He's taken some out of the country travel. But I've been able to canvass the state with Dwayne. Literally in the last 6 months, I've put 21,000 miles on my own car. There isn't a community that doesn't feel like we haven't been to or a part of the state. But in that time, I get to hear a lot of stories from him. And so I've heard a lot of stories about former governors Carlin and Hayden. And that vote description that Governor Hayden gave, while Dwayne was not the 21st vote in the Senate, he was one of the votes in the House. And he describes an equally sort of tough conversation with Governor Hayden to get that vote. So and Dwayne also does a stellar Governor Hayden impression, by the way. I also want to say that I sort of come today wearing 2 hats, and so while I'm currently the Executive Director of the Kansas Center for Economic Growth, on June 1st I'll be stepping in as CEO and President of Kansas Action for Children. So I appreciate the interview that was given by Governor Carlin and Hayden, and I look forward to having you guys step in as KCEG's next Executive Director. The fact of the matter is, we have been led down a path that is so reckless. Kansas's tax policy changes are unprecedented. No other state in the country has tried them, and for good reason. We're all aware of that now. They're also unaffordable. It's time for course correction if we want to restore the state of Kansas. Our goal at KCEG is to make budget and tax policy as accessible as possible, to make it understandable for a broad audience. And we've seen that understanding grow over the course of 4 years since these were signed into place, but we still have more work to do. So we produce briefs and blog posts and infographics, and we kick around ideas to try and convey this to a broad audience. And sometimes when we're sitting around the office, we look for that perfect picture. And our latest perfect picture, if you can't see it, can someone turn out the lights there? I'm better in a dark light anyway. It's a dumpster fire, for those of you in the back of the room. And while humorous and provides some levity to what we face right now, what's going on is absolutely not funny. If you look at the 2 definitions of dumpster fire, one is a complete disaster. The second is something very difficult that nobody wants to deal with, which I think probably accurately sums up our last 2 legislative sessions, if we think about the budget crisis and our tax policy. It's abundantly clear that the changes have left us broke, and that this the tax policy changes are fueling this dumpster fire. If you don't know me and you've never heard me talk before, you'll know that I'm not one for hyperbole, and I'm an absolute numbers nerd, thanks to my accountant mother. But what we're facing isn't just bad, it's catastrophic. We are the punchline of jokes all around the country, and as a native Kansan who's spent almost my entire 40 years here, it's embarrassing. Dwayne and I travel outside of the state as well. We've been invited to Oklahoma and North Carolina and New Hampshire and other states to talk to their legislatures about just how bad it is here. And when we go there, they walk away and they say things like, we don't want to be like Kansas. There was a hashtag, don't be like Kansas. It's not a proud moment, but we have an opportunity to do something different. To be perfectly frank about it, and I think hearing from Governors Carlin and Hayden, I'm going to place a slightly finer point on some of these things. Our jobs, our kids, and the way of life that matters to all of us is dependent on changing course. Everything that matters to everyone in this room is driven by the tax policy changes we've made. We can't have early childhood programs well supported if we don't make changes to tax policy. We can't repair the roads if we don't make changes to tax policy. We can't give raises to state employees. We can't make sure our CAPER system is fully funded unless we make changes to tax policy. Right now, we're living the good life, and I know it doesn't feel like it, but literally next week, the governor is going to announce more budget cuts. Don't worry that you can't see the numbers. I'm going to walk you through the high points of this slide. And there's a handout on your way out if you want to grab that has KCEG's contact information as well as these 3 key points. What you need to know is that there's a green line there that says reoccurring revenue. It stands at $5.7 billion. There's a red line that says reoccurring expenses. It's $6.2 billion. One is less than the other. I don't know how you all run your personal finances, and I'm not going to ask anybody to volunteer that information. But this is not a successful plan for the state of Kansas. For the last several years, our legislature has been doing gimmicks and one-time measures, has been stealing from early childhood programs, has been robbing highway funds, has been now taking from the pension system to try and prop up this budget, just barely getting by. And we'll continue to have to do that until we make changes to the tax policy plan that was passed in 2012 and 2013. You see here that there's a highway fund transfer. There's other one-time fund transfers. We're paying bills with money that wasn't intended. We're paying bills from the general fund with economic development funds. We're paying mental health center bills with highway fund dollars. Those were things that were never intended, and they'll continue until we increase the revenue. This is what 17 looks like. This year starts on July 1st. You can't see it in the back of the room. The green line, the money coming in, $5.9 billion. The red line, what we've approved to spend, $6.3 billion. It's a gap of $424 million. That's to get us to zero. That's leaving no money in the bank account. If we were to include the money that we need, that's statutorily required, the ending balance is 7.5%, we're facing a nearly $1 billion gap in our ongoing revenue and our ongoing expenses. And right now, what we're spending is squeezed so far down, we're not meeting our basic needs. As we were talking about the court case that's pending before the legislature around adequacy and equity, the court is discussing the very small part of that. The equity piece is a smaller part of what the court has yet to decide. The adequacy piece and the price tag on that has been estimated to be anywhere between $400 and $600 million. Where we land on that, it's abundantly clear we're not putting into our public school system what it requires to prepare our kids for the 21st century economy. Not to mention what we've done to higher ed. It was highlighted earlier that we've been cutting higher ed. We've cut higher ed 17% since coming out of the Great Recession. We've shifted those costs onto students through tuition increases and fees. Students are now making up more of what it costs to go than state is. They're coming out with more debt. This is a recipe for disaster for our state. We're going to have a hard time keeping our high school graduates here to enter into our community college and our Regents system. And they certainly aren't going to return back to Kansas if we don't have the jobs for them. Every choice that we've made around tax policy is driving Kansas further and further into the ground. I should have started with this wasn't going to be the most uplifting talk, so I'm glad you all heard the laughs earlier. But this is the truth, and this is what we need you to carry out and talk to folks about. So I need everyone in the room to understand something. We talk about how bad it is right now. I joked about it being a dumpster fire. But we're nowhere near the end of this march to zero. The state still collects 40% of its revenue from income tax. We have a long way to go until we get to zero. Tax cuts are not going to lead to revenue growth. In the office, that's what we call magic math. Right now, we are living the good life. And while the legislature has gone home and we don't have a chance to debate tax policy, we will in 17. And around that debate as it relates to tax policy, I want to tell you that it's far more complicated than just putting 330,000 businesses back on the payroll. Putting 330,000 businesses who currently aren't paying income tax back on and doing nothing else just simply puts them on the march to zero with the rest of us. It was also only 30% of the revenue loss. That wasn't the biggest driver of revenue loss. It was the income rate changes. There is a trigger mechanism in the future that if revenue ever grows, and I know it seems so far-fetched that revenue is going to grow in this state, but should it grow, we're using that revenue to buy down rates. We will be on this march to zero for forever unless we do something about that trigger mechanism, unless we put 330,000 businesses back on, and unless we change something about the rates that we're all paying. This is what it will require to invest in the future of our state. To stop the march to zero, we have to change the entirety of the 2012-2013 tax package. And just a second about the debate that was had in the House. It actually wasn't even a debate. I just want to remind everybody that the LLC, or the closing the small business exemption bill that came before the House for vote, there was no debate on it. It was not amendable. It was decided by 4 folks who put together a conference committee report and then put it before the House to vote on. When just the week prior, the governor said he didn't think that it was worthwhile to have a discussion about tax policy. And instead, he put forward 3 options, all of which involved budget cuts or selling off the early childhood dollars to shore things up, which is why we're calling for option 4, which is to revisit and do something about the 2012-2013 tax plan. The last point on this slide, but not the last point I'm going to make, is this borrowed game plan is not successful for the state of Kansas. And who did we borrow it from? The governor very famously said, "Look out, Texas, here comes Kansas." And that means something to me as a Kansan. I don't want to be like Texas. I certainly want to be like Kansas. And Texas has a whole host of things that we don't want to deal with, to be quite candid. But the other piece is that the 9 no-income tax states, which Texas is one of, have other sources of revenue that we're never going to have. We're never going to have the oil and gas of Texas. We're never going to have the tourism of Texas and Florida and New Hampshire. Despite what a great place I think Kansas is, it's not the tourist destination of the white sandy beaches of Florida. But the other thing that you need to understand is that the 9 no-income tax states also have higher per capita property and/or sales tax. And since starting down this march to zero, what have we done as a state? We've raised sales tax twice. We've raised other taxes. We're increasing fees. Property taxes have gone up all around the state as local communities look to backfill the cuts the state has made. 17 of the 20 fastest growing property tax increases are rural communities. What I will end with, though, is I want to tell you all that the success of this plan is predicated on 3 points. They're counting on you to not be able to do the math. It sounds funny, but they're counting on you to have looked at the slides that I showed you earlier and not be able to shore up the fact that the green and the red don't match up and that that's a problem. They're counting on you not to care that we're shortchanging our kids, not to care that 1/3 of our Kansas counties don't have a highway trooper. Why don't they have a highway trooper? Because we've cut Kansas Highway Patrol. Who are those counties? They're rural counties. Those rural communities can't count on Kansas Highway Patrol to provide services. They're counting on you not to care that our most vulnerable Kansans are on waiting lists for services. or that our poorest Kansans now pay the highest food sales tax rate in the country, or that we refuse to even have a conversation about expanding Medicaid. But lastly, proponents of the March to Zero will claim ultimate victory if you do nothing, and that's what they're counting on. They're counting on this right here today being the last thing you do. We've talked a lot about and heard a lot about the steps between now and the end of the year. I'll tell you from right now, there's 8 months between now and the 2017 legislative session. And there's a lot that you can be doing. I want to highlight someone in the room who was at a presentation that Dwayne and I did down in Winfield. Joanna Brazel, rhymes with dazzle, heard Dwayne and I speak at a Save Our Schools event down in Winfield. And then she went on to Facebook and she wrote a very eloquent and very real summary from her perspective of what we had to say. And within 48 hours, it had 1,200 shares. I was hearing about it, living up in the northeast part of the state, I was hearing about it from friends. They said, did you see this post? And since then, she's gone on to post other things. And thankfully, she's made these posts public. These are the types of actions that we need to all be making once we leave here today, but it can't stop. If it stops, if this is the last thing you do, they will be successful in the March to Zero. That's it. Thank you. I want to quickly comment. There was a question earlier about the Children's Initiative Fund, and not only am I the incoming president and CEO of Kansas Action for Children, but I was also appointed to the Children's Cabinet on Thursday by the Senate Minority Leader. And Governors Carlin and Hayden touched on this. In 1999, the state and the legislature had the brilliance to lock that money into a system to support early childhood education in Kansas. We were one of the few states to do that. Forward-thinking, very creative use of dollars so that we aren't using taxpayer dollars, and we have this steady revenue stream that goes on forever. So long as there are people smoking, the state of Kansas will get money from the tobacco settlement dollars. And I'm not going to start a campaign, Smoke for Kansas Kids, but just know that we have that money coming in, and we have been taking from it. We should have $200 million sitting in the Kansas Endowment for Youth Fund right now, and we've got under $100 million sitting in there. We have been sweeping those funds. If we invested those in early education, the return on investment for early ed is tremendous. For every dollar invested, there's somewhere between $7 and $11 return. By not shoring up early ed, K-12, higher ed, those are things that we can't get back. You can't take a little kid and get back those beginning years, birth to 8. We really are pawning our future with the changes that we've made.
Our first question, regarding the final tax legislation which was voted down. Some moderates said the legislation was flawed, therefore they had to vote against it. Do you agree?
If I were to, and this was my point about the option 4 and looking at the entire package, closing the loophole and the way that it was written, one, there was no amendments that could be offered to that because it was in a conference committee report. But having done that, it would have provided no money for this fiscal year. It wouldn't have paved a road. It wouldn't have saved a school. It would have brought money into future years, but it would not have been the option that would have saved the budget this time around. There has to be a comprehensive discussion. The reason why we talk about option 4 is because there's momentum behind closing the loophole, and there are other key fixes that have to be paired with that. We have to look comprehensively at the entire thing.
Why or on what basis does our Brownback administration describe a rosy lookout on our jobs and our economy? According to them, Kansas is doing just fine.
So I mentioned that my mother is an accountant and retired, and my dad's a social worker and also retired. And so I think at this point my dad would probably be flipping open the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, looking for the diagnosis of that. But I think, you know, what it boils down to is for folks who are still, you know, bought into this notion that this will work. I heard Governor Hayden say earlier that it's hard to admit when you're wrong. I certainly think that there's part of that. I also think that it's driven by trying to find the least colorful words to describe this. I think it's driven by folks who ultimately want to also see changes in the way that we're supporting K-12 and the way government functions in Kansas. This is not just about the success of a tax policy plan, and we know that now. Despite the fact what was said when it was first passed, 2 years later, it was said, well, of course there was some effort to shrink government here, and that's exactly what we're seeing. I think you've seen a shift in the understanding from a growing number of policymakers who now don't believe the numbers, don't believe the magic math. But you also will notice that they offered some metrics at the beginning. We want to grow private jobs. We want to grow the economy. We want to see Kansas lead the region and the nation, and we're not in any of those ways. We're still in the back of the pack in terms of our private job growth for both the region and the nation. Our unemployment rate has dropped, but everybody's unemployment rate's dropped. That's called recovery. And it's not unique to Kansas. But in every other way, we're falling further and further behind. The states around us are seeing increases in revenue. They're getting back to investing in K-12. They're lowering tuition because they're investing in higher ed. They're paving their roads. And meanwhile, we're pulling back. What's stunning about this is that we've actually had a tax increase. We had the largest tax hike in history in the 2015 session, and we're still cutting services. That doesn't make sense. You raise taxes and you're still cutting. That's how disastrous the tax policy of 2012 and 2013 was.
Brownback had to know the income tax exemptions wouldn't work. Don't you think the real objective was to cut state spending?
Some of you need to work on your penmanship. I don't know how Mary's reading those questions. I think it's pretty interesting if you were to sort of follow along the narrative. And I know many of you have. We've known about the adrenaline shot. And then it pivoted to like minor surgery. And then it pivoted to you've got to give it time. We've had 15 rounds of budget cuts coming out of the Great Recession. 7 of them have happened since we started down this plan. That will continue. Whether that was the ultimate goal, I think we've had a greater number of policymakers who have admitted to it. Yeah, we wanted to shrink state government. The governor and I haven't had a personal conversation about it, so I won't speak to him, and I haven't seen him quoted on it. But I will tell you that back in the summer of 2013, when they doubled down and passed the second round, the governor was doing an interview, a taped interview, you can find it, with the Wall Street Journal Washington bureau chief. And in that interview, it's pretty stunning because the governor says, look, I don't know how it works, but it works. You cut income taxes and your sales tax grows. And he didn't know how it worked because it doesn't work that way. And it certainly hasn't worked that way in Kansas.
What enforcement group should be used to arrest those thieves? Just as bank robbers are arrested for their theft.
Seems like maybe there's an open bar I don't know about because pretty colorful question. You know, we have an opportunity to correct the course, and I think that it's important to know there were some things that I didn't mention in terms of putting a finer point on some of the impacts. For those of you who are unaware, the state has a maintenance program for its roads, for all of the highways that the state is responsible for. It used to be 1,200 miles a year. It's now 200 miles a year. And while that may not be meaningful to you, let me put it in the context of how many years it's going to take us to get around the state. Our previous maintenance program would have us going around the entire state about once every 9 years. Once every 9 years, we would touch down on every mile of highway, make sure the cracks were filled, the shoulders were solid. Because of tax policy changes and the way that we've been robbing the highway fund, we've now changed that schedule. And it's now once every 50 years, 50. I'm not going to comment on anybody's life expectancy as I look out across the room. But I am going to tell you that there are roads in Kansas that I will probably not see repaired in my lifetime. While the strength of our highways may be good now, they will quickly deteriorate. And we think about our rural communities and how they rely on those highways. We also think about projects that have now been canceled, projects on highways where people have lost their life. And we intended to expand those roads so as to create safer highways, and we're now not doing that. We can't afford this anymore. So whether you want to arrest them like bank robbers or get out there and tell your friends about what's happening between now and the 2017 session, we have time and we can turn this around. It is a long game, though. Understand that should we get something like option 4, should we get comprehensive tax change, it will not be immediate. It is going to take time to undo the damage that has occurred in the last 3.5 years, which has been extreme and dramatic and like no other state in the country.
How is the legislature avoiding the statutory requirement ending balance?
The 7.5% ending balance can be just forgiven year to year, which is what's been happening. So it's sort of like saying I don't actually have to put money in my savings account, and they don't. And so while we've seen the ending balance fluctuate over time, and there was a lot of erroneous numbers given in terms of what Brownback inherited, we burned through $700 million through the first full year of the tax cuts. We lost more money in revenue in 1 year of the tax cuts than we did in the 3 years of the Great Recession combined. Think about that. We had no choice but to participate in the Great Recession. What we're doing now, we absolutely have a choice, and we have no money left in the savings account. We've almost absolutely cleaned out the entire highway fund. All of those other hundreds of funds that we use for specific purposes have also been cleaned out. There's really nowhere left to go at this point. So it will require raising revenue, but that shouldn't be such a dirty, bad thing. Think of it in this terms: investing in our kids, investing in our future, making sure our higher ed system is well supported, making sure we have strong roads so that businesses want to come here. This is not just a moral argument. This is also a basic business argument. What business is going to want to come here or stay here when they don't have the workforce they need to fill the jobs, when the roads are crumbling and they literally can't get their goods to market? What we've done in Kansas in the last 2 years is not a signal to bring business to our state either.
The last question. Annie, will you please run for governor in 2018?
Thanks, guys.